The busy streets of downtown Los Angeles buzzed with life as people rushed past, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice what was happening in the corner of an alley. A group of rowdy young men surrounded a homeless man, mocking him and kicking at his belongings. Most passersby turned a blind eye, unwilling to get involved, but one man stopped in his tracks, his piercing gaze fixed on the scene. It was Keanu Reeves, and what he did next would not only change the homeless man's life, but also reveal a story no one could have expected. Keanu Reeves stood at the edge of the alley, his sharp eyes taking in the scene before him. The group of young men laughed and jeered, tossing insults at the homeless man who huddled against the wall, clutching a torn blanket. His belongings, a few tattered bags and an old jacket, were scattered on the ground, kicked around like garbage. Keanu's jaw tightened. He wasn't the type to seek attention, but injustice like this struck a chord deep within him. Without hesitation, he strode into the alley, his footsteps deliberate and firm. "Hey!" Keanu's voice rang out, steady but commanding. The laughter stopped immediately as the group turned toward him, their faces a mix of surprise and annoyance. "What's going on here? None of your business, man," one of them sneered, clearly unimpressed by the stranger's simple attire and calm demeanor. "Why don't you just keep walking?" Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "How about you leave him alone?" he said, his tone sharp now, like a blade cutting through the air. The group exchanged glances, the realization of who they were dealing with dawning on them. One of the younger ones whispered, "Isn't that Keanu Reeves?" But the apparent leader of the group wasn't ready to back down. "And what if we don't?" the leader said, his voice challenging but shaky. Keanu stepped closer, his presence alone enough to make the group step back. "Then you'll deal with me," he said, his tone low and firm. "Your choice." The silence that followed was deafening. The group hesitated, the confidence draining from their faces. Without another word, they turned and shuffled away, throwing nervous glances over their shoulders as they disappeared into the crowd. Keanu turned to the homeless man, who stared up at him with wide, bewildered eyes. "You okay?" Keanu asked gently, crouching down to pick up the man's scattered belongings. The man nodded slowly, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, I think so. Thank you." Keanu handed him the tattered jacket and offered a reassuring smile. "Let's get you out of here," he said, helping the man to his feet. Keanu led the man out of the alley, away from the lingering stares of passers-by. They walked a few blocks in silence, the homeless man clutching his belongings tightly, his steps hesitant, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Keanu finally stopped in front of a small, unassuming diner. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. The man looked up at him, his face weary and weathered. Yeah. I can't remember the last time I ate a proper meal." Keanu nodded and opened the door, guiding the man inside. The warm smell of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air, and the soft chatter of diners created a comforting atmosphere. A few heads turned as they entered, some recognizing Keanu immediately. He acknowledged them with a polite nod before leading the man to a booth in the corner. As they sat down, a waitress approached, her eyes widening slightly when she saw Keanu. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone a mix of professionalism and curiosity. Keanu smiled up at her. "2 of whatever's best on the menu, and coffee for both of us, please." The waitress nodded, stealing another glance at him before hurrying off. The man across from Keanu shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the table. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. "Because I've been where you are," he said simply. "Not homeless, but I've been down. I know what it's like to feel like the world's given up on you." The man looked up, surprise flickering across his face. You're one of the biggest stars in the world. How could you ever understand?" Keanu shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Life isn't always as it seems," he said. "We all have our struggles, and sometimes we just need someone to remind us we're worth more than we think." The man stared at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "My name's David," he said, his voice steadier now. "David Coleman." "Nice to meet you, David," Keanu said, extending a hand across the table. David hesitated before shaking it, the simple gesture carrying more weight than either of them realized. The waitress returned with their food, and for the first time in what felt like forever, David ate a meal that wasn't scavenged or cold. Keanu watched him with quiet satisfaction, knowing this was just the beginning. After they finished their meal, Keanu leaned forward, his tone calm but determined. "David, I don't know what brought you to this point, but I'd like to help. If you're ready to take the first step, we can figure this out together." David hesitated, his hands tightening around his coffee mug. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice heavy with shame. "I'm just some guy who lost everything." Keanu shook his head. "You're not just anything. Everyone has a story, and I think yours isn't over yet." David glanced out the diner window, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. His disheveled hair, scruffy beard, and worn clothes painted a picture of a man who had been through more than he could put into words. Slowly he nodded. "All right," he said, "but I don't even know where to start." Keanu smiled. "First things first, let's get you cleaned up." Within an hour they arrived at a boutique hotel where Keanu had reserved a room. David balked at the sight of the luxurious lobby, his eyes wide as he took in the marble floors and glittering chandeliers. "I can't stay here," he said, shaking his head. "I don't belong in a place like this." "You belong wherever you decide you belong," Keanu said firmly. "And right now, you belong here. Let's go." Reluctantly, David followed him to the room. Inside, Keanu handed him a fresh set of clothes and gestured toward the bathroom. "Take your time," he said. "When you're done, we'll talk." David hesitated before stepping inside, closing the door behind him. For the first time in years, he stood under a hot shower, the water washing away the grime and weight of his past. When he emerged, shaved and wearing the clean clothes Keanu had given him, he barely recognized himself in the mirror. Keanu grinned when David stepped into the room. "Now, that's what I call a fresh start." David ran a hand through his neatly trimmed hair, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I feel like a new person," he admitted. Keanu motioned for him to sit down. "Good, because now I want to hear your story. How did you get here?" David sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumping as he took a deep breath. "I wasn't always like this," he began. "I used to have it all, a successful business, a house, a family. But then, everything fell apart." David sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze distant as he began to recount his story. "I ran a tech startup," he said, his voice tinged with both pride and regret. "We developed software for small businesses, tools to help them compete with the big guys. It was my dream, and for a while, it worked. The company took off, and before I knew it, I was living the life I'd always imagined." Keanu listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "What happened?" David exhaled heavily, running a hand over his face. "I trusted the wrong people. My business partner, someone I thought was a friend, started making moves behind my back. He siphoned money out of the company, forged documents, and eventually convinced our investors that I was the problem. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The board voted me out. I lost the company, my savings, everything." Keanu leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "And no one helped? No one stood by you?" David shook his head. "I tried to fight back, but they had everything. Lawyers, connections, resources I couldn't compete with. My wife couldn't handle the stress, and she left. I don't blame her. I wasn't the man she married anymore. After that, well, it wasn't long before I ended up on the street." Keanu's jaw tightened, his fists clenching subtly. The story hit close to home. He'd heard too many tales of greed and betrayal in his life, and this one stirred something deep within him. "That's not right," he said quietly. "No one deserves to be treated like that." David shrugged, his shoulders heavy with defeat. "That's the world, isn't it? The strong crush the weak, and everyone else just moves on." "Not always," Keanu said firmly. "Sometimes, the strong stand up for the weak." David looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." Keanu met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "Because I've seen what kindness can do, and because I believe everyone deserves a second chance." David was silent for a moment, his eyes searching Keanu's face for any hint of insincerity. He found none. Finally, he nodded. "I don't know how, but if there's a way to fix this, I'm willing to try." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's all I need to hear." Determined to help David reclaim his life, Keanu began leveraging his resources and connections. He reached out to a trusted private investigator to gather information on David's former business partner and the fraudulent activities that led to David's downfall. Within days, they had a comprehensive dossier detailing the embezzlement and deceit that had stripped David of his company. Armed with this evidence, Keanu arranged a meeting with a top-tier attorney known for taking on corporate corruption cases. They discussed the possibility of legal action to not only expose the wrongdoing, but also to seek restitution for David. The attorney agreed to take the case, moved by David's plight and Keanu's unwavering support. Meanwhile, Keanu encouraged David to reconnect with his passion for technology. He introduced him to industry events and networking opportunities, helping him rebuild his professional reputation. David was initially hesitant, but with Keanu's encouragement, he began to regain his confidence. As the legal proceedings progressed, the media caught wind of the story. Headlines praised Keanu's altruism and highlighted the injustice David had suffered. Public support swelled, putting additional pressure on the perpetrators and bolstering David's resolve. Throughout this journey, Keanu remained by David's side, offering not just resources, but genuine friendship. They shared meals, attended events, and spent time discussing life, dreams, and the future. David couldn't believe the turn his life had taken, from destitution to having one of Hollywood's biggest stars as his ally. One evening, as they sat overlooking the city, David turned to Keanu, emotion evident in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You've given me my life back." Keanu smiled, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "You had the strength to start over. I just helped you see it. Now, let's get your company back." With the case gaining traction and evidence mounting, Keanu and David found themselves preparing for the ultimate confrontation. David's former business partner, now exposed as a fraud, was being brought to court to answer for his actions. The case had become a media sensation, with headlines reading, "Hollywood star fights for justice for homeless entrepreneur." The day of the hearing arrived, and David stood outside the courthouse, fidgeting with the cuffs of his shirt. Keanu stood beside him, exuding calm confidence. "You ready for this?" Keanu asked, his voice steady. David nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. "I think so," he said. "But it's been so long. What if it doesn't go the way we hope?" Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "No matter what happens in there, you're already winning. You're standing up for yourself, and that's more powerful than anything they did to you." Inside the courtroom, David's former business partner sat at the defendant's table, flanked by an expensive legal team. He looked smug, but the confidence faltered when David entered with Keanu by his side. Whispers rippled through the room as people recognized the actor, and the tension became palpable. The trial was grueling, with hours of testimony, cross-examinations, and heated exchanges. The defense tried to paint David as an incompetent businessman, but the evidence Keanu's team had gathered was airtight. Emails, forged documents, and bank statements laid bare the web of deceit that had destroyed David's life. When it was David's turn to testify, he spoke with raw honesty about his rise, fall, and the years he spent on the streets. His words moved the courtroom, and even the judge seemed visibly affected. "I lost everything," David said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "But I'm here today because someone reminded me that I'm more than what I've been through. I'm here to take back what's mine, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been told they don't matter." Keanu watched from the gallery, his heart swelling with pride. David's strength and determination were on full display, and it was clear he was no longer the defeated man he'd been just weeks ago. By the end of the trial, the evidence was overwhelming. The court ruled in David's favor, awarding him damages and restoring his ownership of the company. The room erupted into applause as the judge's gavel fell, signaling a victory not just for David, but for justice. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Reeves, why did you get involved in this case?" one asked. Keanu smiled softly, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he said simply. "And sometimes, all it takes is someone believing in you." The courtroom victory was more than just a legal win. It marked the beginning of a new chapter for David. With his company restored and compensation awarded, he was finally in a position to rebuild his life. But this time, he wasn't doing it alone. Keanu had become more than a friend. He was a mentor, a guide, and a constant source of support. Over the next few weeks, they worked together to rebuild David's business. Keanu introduced him to trustworthy advisors and investors, ensuring he wouldn't face the same betrayal again. One evening, as they sat in David's newly rented office space, surrounded by blueprints and business plans, David leaned back in his chair, a rare smile on his face. "It feels surreal," he admitted. "I went from sleeping on the streets to this, all because of you." Keanu shook his head. "No, David, you got here because you didn't give up. You put in the work and you fought for what's yours. I just gave you a little push." David looked at him, his gratitude evident. "Still, I wouldn't have made it without you. I don't know how to thank you." Keanu grinned, leaning forward. "You want to thank me? Then make this business better than it's ever been. Use it to help people like you, people who've been knocked down but aren't out." David nodded, determination flaring in his eyes. "I will. That's a promise." As the days turned into weeks, David's company began to thrive again. He hired a team of dedicated employees, many of whom had experienced hardships similar to his own. The company's mission shifted to focus not just on profit, but on creating opportunities for people in need. The media continued to follow the story, hailing it as a tale of redemption and kindness. But Keanu avoided the spotlight, insisting that the focus remain on David and his remarkable journey. David's business wasn't just bouncing back, it was thriving. The company, now rebranded with a new name symbolizing resilience, began making waves in the tech world. But it wasn't just about the profits. David had committed himself to giving back. He started programs to mentor aspiring entrepreneurs, offering scholarships and funding to those who needed a second chance, just like he'd been given. One afternoon, as David wrapped up a meeting, he found Keanu waiting for him in the office lobby. Dressed in his signature casual style, Keanu greeted him with a warm smile. "How's my favorite CEO?" he joked. David grinned. "Busy, but in the best way possible. You were right. It feels better to lift others up than to just focus on myself." "That's what it's all about," Keanu said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You've turned this into something incredible, David. I hope you're proud." "I am," David admitted, his voice steady with newfound confidence. "But I couldn't have done it without you." Keanu laughed lightly. "You keep saying that, but you don't need me to remind you anymore. You're doing this on your own now." As they sat down in David's office, the conversation turned to the past. David shared more details about the struggles he'd faced and the lessons he'd learned. "It's funny," he said thoughtfully. "Losing everything was the hardest thing I've ever been through, but it also taught me what really matters. Not the money, not the status, just having people who believe in you." Keanu nodded, his expression reflective. "It's true. At the end of the day, it's the connections we make that define us." The two men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey settling around them. Then David looked up, a sly smile on his face. "So, when do I get to repay the favor?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Repay me?" "Yeah," David said. "You've been there for me every step of the way. If you ever need help, whether it's for you or someone else, you know where to find me." Keanu chuckled, clearly moved. "I'll hold you to that." Months passed, and David's life had taken a complete turn. His business was thriving, his mission to uplift others was in full swing, and he had reconnected with parts of himself he thought he'd lost forever. The media buzz around his story had died down, but his work spoke louder than any headlines ever could. One evening, Keanu invited David to his home for dinner. The atmosphere was casual and warm, the kind of gathering that didn't rely on luxury but on genuine connection. As they sat in the living room, sipping coffee after the meal, Keanu handed David a small, wrapped package. "What's this?" David asked, tilting his head. "Open it," Keanu said with a smile. David tore the paper carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal. His fingers traced the cover, and he opened it to find blank pages waiting to be filled. "A fresh journal?" he asked, his voice soft. Keanu nodded. "It's for the next chapter. You've been through so much, and now it's time to write your own story, on your own terms." David smiled, a wave of gratitude washing over him. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when I first saw you in that alley, I wasn't sure how this would turn out, but you've shown me, and everyone else, that no matter how far someone falls, they can always rise again." David nodded, clutching the journal tightly. I wouldn't have made it without you, but now I'm ready to stand on my own. That's all I could ever ask for, Keanu said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. To new beginnings. David raised his own cup, his heart full. To new beginnings. As the evening wound down, David and Keanu sat under the stars in Keanu's quiet backyard. The glow of string lights cast a soft warmth over the space, and the hum of the city was faint in the background. For a moment, neither of them spoke, content in the silence of a friendship forged through resilience and trust. David broke the quiet, his voice steady and reflective. You know, when I was at my lowest, I thought it was the end. I didn't see a way forward, but then you came along and showed me there's always another chance. Keanu turned to him, his expression calm but filled with sincerity. I didn't do anything extraordinary, David. I just saw someone who deserved better and gave them a hand. The rest, you did that. David shook his head with a smile. You did more than that. You reminded me who I was and what I'm capable of. That's something I'll never forget. Keanu chuckled lightly. Well, just promise me one thing. When someone else needs a hand, you'll be there for them. That's how we keep it going. David nodded firmly. I promise. You've shown me what that kind of kindness can do. The two men raised their glasses one more time, the stars above them bearing witness to a moment that neither of them would forget. Keanu knew that David's story wasn't just one of redemption. It was a reminder that a little compassion could go a long way. As David left that evening, walking toward his car with the new journal tucked under his arm, he felt lighter than he had in years. He wasn't just the man who had lost everything anymore. He was someone with a future, a purpose, and a friend who had believed in him when no one else did. Keanu watched him go, a small smile on his face. For him, this wasn't about gratitude or recognition. It was simply about doing the right thing, because sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. This story reminds us that kindness and second chances can transform lives in ways we never expect. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where compassion made all the difference? Share your story in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring tales.